Take your suitcase and go, Margaret. This house stopped being yours the day my father-in-law died. My daughter-in-law, Jessica said while snow pressed softly against the kitchen windows, and for a moment I thought I had misunderstood her because grief has a strange way of slowing the world down, making cruel things sound far away, almost unreal. But then she folded her arms and looked toward the hallway where my old coat hung beside the umbrella stand, and I understood perfectly. The clock above the stove read 8:14 p.m. The chicken soup I had reheated sat untouched in a bowl growing cold beside my tea. Daniel, my son, stood near the refrigerator without looking at me. His shoulders sagged, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed somewhere near the floor as though silence itself might save him from choosing sides. 3 months earlier, my husband Richard had still been alive, sitting in the same chair near the window, teasing me about adding too much salt to dinner and reaching for my hand whenever old sitcom reruns came on television. The house had once sounded different. Warm, familiar, safe. But grief changes a family. Or maybe it reveals what was quietly waiting underneath all along. Jessica sighed like I was inconveniencing her. We need our privacy, she said calmly. You'll be happier somewhere smaller. Maybe one of those senior apartments. Outside, snow drifted beneath the porch light, thick and silent, covering the driveway in white. The weather report had warned of nearly 8 inches overnight, enough to turn sidewalks slick and quiet streets lonely. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. No one stopped me. No one argued. My suitcase was already sitting beside the front door. That hurt more than her words. Someone had packed for me without asking. A folded sweater, prescription bottles, a pair of sensible winter shoes. My life reduced to what fit beside a doormat. I buttoned my coat carefully, fingers stiff from cold, and something heavier than cold. Sadness, maybe. Disappointment. Or the strange stillness that comes when pain arrives so quietly you barely hear it enter the room. Jessica glanced at her phone. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Neither of them looked frightened of losing me. That realization settled inside my chest heavier than grief. I reached for the old scarf Richard bought me during a road trip through Vermont years ago. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet upstairs. Upstairs, I wondered if I would ever sleep in that little bedroom again, the one where sunlight landed softly across the dresser every morning. I'll go, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. No tears, no anger, just exhaustion. I opened the front door. Cold rushed toward me like another kind of silence. Snowflakes gathered instantly on my sleeves. The neighborhood looked blurred and unfamiliar beneath winter light. I pulled my suitcase behind me and stepped into the night, thinking I had finally reached the loneliest moment of my life. I did not know that somewhere less than 10 miles away, a flat tire on a dark road was quietly waiting to change everything. Snow softened every sound as I walked farther down Maple Street, the wheels of my suitcase catching against frozen patches of sidewalk while cold air slipped through the sleeves of my coat and settled against my skin. The neighborhood looked different at night, especially under fresh snow. Porch lights glowed warmly behind curtains, while fireplaces flickered inside homes that still belonged to people who were expected when dinner was ready. I lowered my head and kept walking because standing still felt worse somehow. The silence around me felt enormous, heavy enough to press against my chest. My fingers ached inside my gloves, and I stopped beneath a street lamp to tighten the scarf around my neck. Richard had bought it during our anniversary trip through Vermont nearly 15 years ago, after laughing at how stubbornly I refused to admit I was cold. You always underestimate winter, he had told me while wrapping it around my shoulders himself. I remembered the sound of his voice so clearly that for a second I almost turned, foolishly expecting him to still be there beside me. But grief had become like that lately. Small moments ambushed me. The empty chair near the kitchen window. The smell of cedar after opening the hallway closet. The quiet after evening news broadcasts ended. Before he died, I never imagined loneliness could have weight, but now it followed me everywhere like another coat I could not remove. I reached the small diner near the gas station at the edge of town and stood outside for a moment beneath the neon sign buzzing softly overhead. Open 24 hours. A blessing, really. I pushed the door open and warm air rushed over me carrying the smell of coffee, bacon, and fresh pie crust. A young waitress with tired eyes smiled politely. Long night? She asked gently. I nodded and asked for hot tea because it felt easier than explaining anything. I sat near the window where I could still see snow piling quietly across parked cars. Around me, truck drivers ate late dinners, couples sat in booths whispering over pancakes, and an older man read the newspaper beneath dim lighting near the counter. Ordinary life continued around me, while mine seemed to have slipped sideways without warning. I wrapped both hands around the steaming mug when it arrived and stared outside, trying not to think too hard about where I would sleep. A motel maybe, if there were vacancies during the storm. My savings existed, though Jessica always acted as if I were helpless, fragile, inconvenient. That word settled unpleasantly in my mind. Inconvenient. Was that what I had become to my own son after 69 years of birthdays, scraped knees, packed school lunches, and late-night worries? I swallowed slowly and looked through the fog glass toward the road, where snow continued falling in silver sheets. Somewhere out there, headlights moved carefully through the dark, and for reasons I could not explain, I suddenly felt the strange pull that life was quietly shifting beneath my feet, even if I could not yet see where it was leading me. The diner grew quieter as the evening stretched deeper into night, plates disappearing from tables one by one, while the storm outside thickened into something soft and endless. I finished my tea slowly, warming my hands against the mug longer than necessary, because warmth suddenly felt precious. The waitress returned once with a gentle smile and topped off my hot water without asking questions. I appreciated that more than I could explain. At my age, people sometimes looked at loneliness with pity, but kindness without curiosity felt rare. I paid my bill carefully, adding a tip Richard would have approved of, then stood near the front window watching snow sweep across the empty parking lot beneath pale streetlights. I knew I should find somewhere to sleep before the roads worsened. A small roadside motel sat less than 2 miles away, though even the thought of walking there with my suitcase made my knees ache in advance. I stepped outside anyway, pulling my coat tighter around me as cold air rushed against my face. Snow landed softly on my scarf and eyelashes while the wind whispered across the highway. Cars moved carefully now, slower than before, headlights blurred against the weather. I had walked only a short distance when I heard the faint sound of frustration nearby, not loud or dramatic, just someone muttering beneath their breath. Across the road near a dim shoulder sat an older sedan with its hazard lights blinking steadily against the storm. Beside it stood a tall man in a dark coat, bent awkwardly near the rear tire, glancing toward the empty road as though hoping luck might suddenly appear. Something about the sight made me pause. Maybe it was habit. Richard had never liked driving past trouble without stopping. People remember kindness on bad nights, he used to say whenever we pulled over to help someone with directions or jumper cables. I hesitated for only a second before crossing carefully toward the shoulder, dragging my suitcase behind me through fresh snow. Looks like winter picked a terrible time for that tire. I called gently, my voice sounding smaller than I expected beneath the wind. The man turned, surprised at first, then embarrassed. You would think after 70 years I would know better than to trust old tires, he said with a tired laugh. His face remained partly shadowed beneath the brim of a wool cap, though his voice carried something strangely familiar, something warm and steady that tugged faintly at memory. I glanced toward the trunk. Do you have a spare? I asked. He nodded. I do. Just not the patience I used to. That made me smile despite everything. Strange how sadness loosens its grip for one unexpected second. Together we moved toward the trunk, snow collecting silently on our shoulders while he fumbled with a flashlight that refused to cooperate. I reached for it without thinking. Hold still, I said softly. You are making this harder than it needs to be. He laughed again, low and familiar somehow, and for reasons I could not explain, standing beside that stranded car in the middle of nowhere no longer felt quite so lonely. The flashlight flickered once before steadying in my hands, casting pale light across snow packed around the tire, while cold wind moved quietly across the empty shoulder of the road. The man knelt awkwardly near the trunk, muttering something under his breath about modern tools never working when needed, and I found myself smiling despite the ache still sitting heavy inside my chest. There was something strangely comforting about ordinary inconvenience. A stubborn flashlight, cold fingers, shared silence. For a few minutes, grief loosened enough for me to breathe. You hold the light better than I do, he said with a tired laugh while brushing snow from his coat sleeve. I suppose age teaches patience, I replied. Or at least survival. He glanced up at me then, longer this time, as though studying my face through drifting snow. The light caught silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. Familiar lines somehow. Familiar warmth. But memory is strange when you are tired and cold. It offers pieces before explanations. You sound like somebody I used to know, he said casually, almost to himself. I looked away toward the road. At my age, we all sound like somebody used to know. That made him laugh softly again, and the sound settled oddly inside me, quiet and familiar in ways I could not yet place. We worked slowly together, more careful than quick. He apologized twice for taking too long. I teased him once for pretending he could still move like a young man. Snow gathered on the shoulders of our coats until we looked equally dusted and white. Strange how companionship can arrive. Without invitation. 30 minutes earlier, I had stood outside my son's house feeling erased. Now I stood beside a stranded stranger arguing politely over the safest way to steady a jack beneath an old sedan. Life shifts without warning sometimes. 1 minute unbearable. The next unexpectedly human again. There, he said finally, standing straighter once the spare tire sat secured. I owe you dinner at the very least. A cup of coffee sounds safer, I replied automatically, surprising myself. He smiled. Fair enough. Then he stopped suddenly, really looking at me for the first time beneath the glow of the flashlight. Snow drifted between us. Quiet stretched. I am sorry, he said slowly, voice softer now. This is going to sound strange, but did you ever live in Cedar Grove? The question landed somewhere deep enough to stop my breath for a second. Cedar Grove, a town I had not heard spoken aloud in years. Friday football games. Summer fairs. Lockers painted dull blue. A life that belonged to another version of me. Yes, I answered carefully. A very long time ago. His expression changed immediately, surprise giving way to something gentler, almost disbelieving. Margaret, he asked quietly. My heart stumbled strangely against memory. Snow continued falling around us, soft and endless, while I looked closer at the man standing beneath weak roadside light, and finally saw what grief and exhaustion had hidden from me. The steady eyes, the crooked warmth in his smile, the face older now, but still unmistakable. Tom, I whispered, hardly trusting the sound of my own voice. For a moment, neither of us moved. Snow drifted quietly between us while the years folded strangely inward, as though time itself had stepped aside without asking permission. Tom Bennett, 17 years old again, flashed through my memory before I could stop it. Friday football games beneath bright stadium lights. Cheap milkshakes after school dances. Long summer evenings beside Cedar Grove Lake, where we believed life would wait patiently for us to grow into it. I had not spoken his name in decades, and yet standing there beneath a weak roadside light, I recognized something steady in him. Immediately. Older, certainly. Softer around the edges. But unmistakably Tom. He let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Margaret Whitmore, he said carefully, shaking his head once as though confirming I was real. I cannot believe this. I laughed quietly, though it came out unsteady from cold and surprise. I suppose winter storms are full of strange ideas. He smiled then, the same crooked smile that used to appear whenever he forgot to take life too seriously. It startled me how familiar it still felt. You still say things like that, he said warmly. Like what? Like somebody who notices the weather before everybody else notices themselves. I shook my head, embarrassed despite myself. You remember ridiculous things. I remember everything, he answered softly, and something about the honesty in his voice made me glance away toward the road. The storm had thickened now, headlights moving slowly through white haze. Snow gathered on the hood of his sedan. The night felt suspended somehow, quieter than before. What are the chances? I asked eventually. 70 years old and stranded in a snowstorm. 70, he corrected with mock offense. 70 and still changing my own tire. Thank you. That pulled a laugh from me I had not expected, the first real laugh in months. It surprised me enough to feel almost unfamiliar. Tom looked at me carefully then, concern slipping into his expression. Margaret, he said gently, forgive me for asking, but what are you doing out here alone in weather like this? The question settled heavily between us. I looked toward my suitcase sitting crooked in fresh snow near the shoulder of the road. Suddenly, I felt tired in a way that reached beyond my bones. Tired from grief, from silence, from swallowing humiliation until even dignity felt fragile. Life became complicated, I answered quietly. It sounded smaller than truth. He followed my gaze to the suitcase and frowned slightly, though he did not press. I appreciated that immediately. Age teaches you who asks questions because they care and who asks because they are curious. Tom had always known how to wait. He glanced toward his car, then back at me. There is a coffee place open about 15 minutes from here, he said carefully. Warm lights. Terrible pie. Excellent coffee. We could sit for a little while until the road settled down. He hesitated before adding, softer now. You should not be standing alone out here tonight. I looked at him, really looked this time, and for reasons I could not explain, standing beside him no longer made the world feel quite so cold. I hesitated only long enough to look once more at the road disappearing into white darkness before nodding quietly. Pride becomes a strange thing after loss. Some days it keeps you standing. Other days it leaves you standing alone too long. Tom walked toward the passenger side of his sedan and opened the door carefully, as though something fragile had returned to him without warning. The heater takes a minute, he said apologetically. She is older than both of us put together. I settled carefully into the seat, brushing snow from my coat, while warmth slowly pushed against the cold that had settled deep into my hands. The inside of the car smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, familiar in ways I could not explain. A folded road map sat beside neatly stacked receipts in the center console. A wool blanket rested across the back seat. Practical things. Quiet things. The kind of details that suggested someone who had learned to live carefully after disappointment. Tom climbed into the driver's seat and gave me a quick glance before starting the engine. You still hate driving in snow? He asked with a small smile. I blinked, surprised. I forgot I ever told you that. You told me everything back then, he said softly, eyes returning to the road. For a second, neither of us spoke. Snow moved steadily beneath the headlights while windshield wipers pushed quiet rhythm across the glass. Memory sat between us now, not uncomfortable exactly, only strange. 50 years felt impossibly long, and somehow very short at the same time. Do you still live around here? I finally asked. Tom nodded. About 20 minutes outside town. Small place near the lake. I moved back after retirement. He paused briefly. Life circles back sometimes. I looked out the window. I suppose it does. He glanced toward me again, careful, kind. And you? The question arrived gently enough that I answered more honestly than I expected. I was living with my son after Richard passed away. The words felt heavier spoken aloud. Tom's expression shifted, concern settling quietly into place. Richard, he repeated softly. Your husband? I nodded once. 3 months ago. He lowered his eyes briefly toward the steering wheel. Margaret, I am sorry. No dramatic sympathy. No awkward silence. Just sincerity. It reached me more deeply than I expected. Thank you, I whispered. Snow thickened again outside while warm air slowly softened the stiffness in my shoulders. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, Tom adjusted the heat slightly and reached toward the back seat for the wool blanket. Here, he said simply. You are freezing. I almost refused out of habit, then stopped myself. The truth was I had spent so many months pretending to be strong that I had forgotten kindness did not always come with conditions. I wrapped the blanket over my knees and stared quietly through the windshield while pale light reflected off endless snow. There is a diner ahead, Tom said after a while. Good coffee. Terrible pie. Same terrible pie since 1972. For the first time all night, I felt something unfamiliar stir beneath exhaustion. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. Relief perhaps. Or maybe just the feeling that life had not completely forgotten me after all. The diner sat at the edge of a quiet highway beneath a flickering sign that looked as though it had survived every winter since the 1970s without apology. Warm yellow lights spilled across fresh snow while Tom parked near the entrance and switched off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The heater hummed softly around us, and I realized I had not felt warm in hours. Maybe longer than hours. Maybe months. Still terrible pie? I asked quietly, surprising myself. Tom smiled, resting one hand lightly against the steering wheel. Worse, actually, which somehow makes it comforting. I laughed under my breath, and something in his expression softened when he heard it, as though relief had settled over him too. Inside, warmth wrapped around us immediately. The smell of coffee, toasted bread, and cinnamon drifted through the room, while old country music played softly overhead. Only a few booths were occupied this late. A truck driver near the counter, a young couple sharing fries, two older women drinking coffee beneath a hanging lamp. Ordinary people, ordinary life. Somehow it felt comforting after everything. Tom guided me toward a booth near the back where snow-covered windows blurred the outside world into pale shadows. He slid into the seat across from me, careful and familiar in a way I could not explain. The waitress arrived carrying menus neither of us touched. "Coffee?" she asked. Tom nodded immediately. "And tea for Margaret," he added before glancing at me with quiet amusement. "Unless 50 years changed your mind." I blinked at him, startled. "You remember that too?" "You hated coffee," he said simply. Said it tasted like disappointment. I laughed again before I could stop myself, and this time the sound surprised me even more. It had been months since laughter felt natural. Maybe longer. The waitress left, and silence settled between us, not awkward exactly, only full. Memory crowded quietly at the edges. Football games, graduation gowns, summers beside Cedar Grove Lake. The version of myself I had almost forgotten. Tom rested his hands around a sugar packet while studying me gently. "I tried finding you once," he admitted after a while. The words caught me off guard. "After high school?" He nodded. "College happened. Then life happened. I heard you married Richard." He gave a small shrug. I figured maybe timing simply had other plans. I looked down at the table for a second, tracing invisible circles against the wood grain. Funny how regret sneaks quietly into old age. Not sharp enough to wound anymore, only enough to ache. "Richard was a good man," I said softly. "Kind. Steady." Tom nodded immediately. "I am glad." There was no bitterness in his voice, only sincerity. That somehow made the sadness easier to carry. The waitress returned with steaming drinks, and warmth curled upward between us. Outside, snow continued falling across dark roads while inside something unfamiliar settled quietly beneath my ribs. Safety perhaps, or maybe recognition. Because for the first time since Richard died, and certainly for the first time that terrible night, I no longer felt entirely alone. The tea warmed my hands while snow pressed softly against the windows, turning the world outside into something distant and unreal. Inside, the diner hummed quietly with silverware clinking against plates and old music drifting low from speakers near the ceiling. For the first time in months, I did not feel like I had to brace myself against silence. Tom stirred sugar into his coffee slowly, glancing toward me now and then with the same thoughtful expression I remembered from high school, the one he used whenever he was deciding whether to ask a question or simply wait for me to speak first. "Do you remember graduation night?" he asked eventually, smiling faintly. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "The rainstorm?" He pointed toward me immediately. "Exactly. Everybody else ran for cover, and you stood there pretending thunderstorms were romantic." I shook my head. "I was 17 and dramatic." "You were 17 and stubborn," he corrected warmly. "There is a difference." I smiled into my tea, surprised by how easy memory suddenly felt. Grief had made every memory of the past feel heavy lately, but this felt different. Lighter somehow. Familiar without hurting. Tom leaned back against the booth and looked out toward the snow for a moment before speaking again. "Life moved fast after Cedar Grove," he said quietly. "Marriage, work, raising kids. Then retirement arrived before I had fully figured out adulthood." I nodded. "Funny how that happens." He smiled sadly. "My wife passed 6 years ago." His voice stayed steady, but something softened in his expression. "Cancer. Quiet and unfair." I lowered my eyes briefly. Loss recognizes loss without explanation. "I am sorry," I said gently. "Thank you," he answered. She was a good woman. No bitterness. No complicated sorrow spilling across the table. Just honesty. I understood that immediately. Love does not disappear. Because grief arrives. It simply changes shape and learns how to sit beside memory. Outside, headlights passed slowly through falling snow. Inside, warmth settled between us while steam curled softly from our cups. Tom looked at me carefully then, concern returning to his face in a way he had politely avoided until now. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you do not have to answer if it feels too personal, but are you all right?" I opened my mouth to say yes automatically, The same answer women my age learn to give even when life has quietly cracked around them. But the word stopped somewhere in my throat. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the mug. The wedding ring Richard placed there decades ago felt suddenly heavy. I do not think I am, I admitted softly. The honesty startled even me. Tom said nothing at first. He simply waited. Outside, snow continued falling without urgency. Inside, nobody rushed me. Things changed after Richard died, I said carefully. The house changed. My son changed. I suppose grief rearranged more than I expected. I stopped there, unable to say the rest yet. Unable to explain the suitcase waiting beside me like proof of something broken. Tom nodded once, slow and steady. Whatever happened, he said quietly, you do not have to carry tonight alone. I stared into my tea for a long moment after Tom spoke, watching the steam curl softly upward while something inside me loosened in a way I had not expected. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe grief, or maybe it was simply the strange relief of sitting across from someone who remembered who I had been before life became responsibilities and routines and quiet disappointments folded carefully into drawers. Outside, snow continued drifting beneath the diner lights, soft and endless, while inside warmth gathered around us like something patient. I finally exhaled slowly. Tonight was harder than I expected, I admitted, my voice quieter than before. Tom did not interrupt. He only listened, hands folded loosely around his coffee cup. After Richard passed, everything changed little by little. I continued carefully. Not overnight. That would almost have been easier to understand. It was smaller than that. Conversations grew shorter. Rooms started feeling borrowed. Decisions happened around me instead of with me. Saying the words aloud made them feel painfully real. Tom nodded once, expression steady. The kind of loneliness that arrives while people are still standing beside you, he said softly. I looked up at him then, surprised by how exactly he understood. Yes, I whispered. Exactly that. Silence settled briefly between us, not uncomfortable, only thoughtful. Somewhere near the counter a waitress laughed softly, while dishes clinked together in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Somehow comforting. Tom leaned back slightly and glanced toward the snow outside before returning his attention to me. You always carried things quietly, he said. Even back then. I smiled faintly. You remember too much. No, he said warmly. I remember enough. Something about the kindness in his voice made my chest ache unexpectedly. I had spent months feeling invisible. Useful when convenient. Quiet when expected. Grief had made me smaller inside my own life. And tonight had nearly convinced me I had nowhere left to stand. Yet somehow, sitting beneath flickering diner lights with a man I had not seen in 50 years, I felt seen again. Tom stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. Do you remember Cedar Grove Lake? He asked after a moment. I laughed softly through tiredness. The bench near the old dock. He smiled immediately. You used to say you wanted to grow old somewhere quiet with decent coffee and enough trees to hear wind at night. I blinked at him. I had forgotten saying that entirely. Funny what other people remember when you forget pieces of yourself. Life did not exactly follow the script, I said gently. Life rarely does, he replied. Then, after a small pause, his expression turned thoughtful again. Margaret, he said quietly, careful as though testing fragile ground. Roads are not safe tonight, and you should not be figuring everything out alone in weather like this. I have a guest room. Fresh sheets. A warm house near the lake. No expectations attached. Just shelter until morning. He hesitated before adding, softer now. You do not have to decide anything about tomorrow tonight. I looked toward the snow pressed thick against the windows and realized I had no real destination waiting for me beyond darkness and cold, only uncertainty. And for the first time all evening, uncertainty no longer felt quite so frightening.